Hello, everyone. Welcome to Remaking the Table. This is a monthly webinar series about community engagement and research hosted by SFU's Community Engaged Research Initiative, also known as CERi. This webinar is about decolonizing practices as they relate to community engaged research, featuring contributions from Jessie Williams and Chris Lewis. My name is Jackie Wong. I work at CERi on community projects, and I'm so thrilled to be facilitating this conversation and to be in the company of all of you here today as you're tuning in from wherever you are. CERi carries out its work from unceded Indigenous territory, including land belonging to the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. While decolonizing practices are the focus of this discussion here today, a continued reckoning with our own entanglements in colonial systems and supremacist structures is an ongoing journey in all of our work here at CERi. We recently released a handbook for community engaged research that some of you might be aware of, and I'll include the link in our chat in just a moment. And I just wanted to share that I really resonate with this passage that was written by two of the authors, Tara Mahoney and Patty Fraser. And they wrote this in the first pages of the handbook. They said, "We acknowledge the sovereignty and equality of Indigenous nations and are guided by aspirations to remake Canada into a decolonial state comprised of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who function with respect for one another. Given that the majority of higher education institutions in Canada are on unceded traditional territories of Indigenous people and inequities from colonization are ongoing in Canadian society, we see community engaged research as an actionable strategy for change that aims to make visible Indigenous ways of knowing that have traditionally been excluded across research settings and institutions. Within this acknowledgement, we seek to deepen our responsibility and respect for one another, the land, and the culture of this place." That's the writing of Tara Mahoney and Patty Fraser in the first pages of the CERi handbook, and it's with deep responsibility and great respect that I move into this conversation today. So thinking about that, I'd like to take a moment for all of us to think about how we're gathering today and to consider particularly what it looks like through the community agreements that we're going to put up on the next slide here. We'll also paste those in detail in the chat. So we'll go to the second slide here to look at these agreements. Actually, I'm going to ask you to move to the community agreement slide. Sorry about that. I just wanted to pause to note in this section, this might be familiar to some of you who've been registering through Eventbrite earlier. I wanted to see and note that we are, many of us here, 143 of us here, coming to this space and this discussion from a number of different backgrounds and learning journeys. And we're really working to respect that and build, even in this Zoom space, a spirit of real mutual support and respect for the diverse journeys we're on. We really hope to make this a comfortable learning space for you. So for those of you who might be taking notes from this session to apply for further learning, I want you to know that we'll be doing our best to do this in the chat, but also in emails later on to share any resources that are named in the webinar. You can also enable a live transcription of this session and view the transcript in the chat as we move through this. So you can see that at the bottom of your Zoom browser. You can look at there's a menu option that says view full transcript, and you can enable live transcription if that's helpful for you. There'll also be a written recap and a video recording of this session that will be available on CERi's website in coming weeks. I also want to note that, we're only here together until just about 2 o'clock. So as much as I'm so excited about the conversation that we're about to have, this is a little bit different than other pedagogical exchanges in that we both expect and we accept non-closure. We might not come to this space with a fully, finished idea of what this all is and what this means to us. I'd like to move back a slide for a moment to take a quick look at the agenda for the day. You'll see here that we'll move into audience questions at about 1:30, and we invite you to voice your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom, which is at the bottom of your Zoom browser. You can see a button that says Q&A. You can ask questions in there at any time during the time that the panelists are speaking. And we'll also be inviting folks to connect with each other, share reflections, comment on the discussion, share resources through a secondary secure digital space that we've created for this event using a platform called Padlet. We're going to include a link in the chat to Padlet, and this is a space where you can post by entering a password into the chat. The password is decolonize after we see the Padlet link going up in here. And all of your posts will be anonymous unless you sign in using a Padlet account. So you can comment on people's posts, star them in the platform. You can introduce yourself if you'd like. And we'll also be taking questions and reflections from that space as well. So before we introduce the panelists today, we'd like to learn a little bit more about the people in this room joining us. As you know, there's 160 of us here now, and we can't actually see each other in this space because a Zoom webinar is such that we can see the panelists, but audience members can't see each other. So I wanted to launch a couple of polls to ask people about where they're calling in from today, and I really welcome the people who are coming in from out of the country, from communities across Canada and across the province particularly. Thanks for participating here. This is a monthly webinar series, so we've been welcoming some regular guests and familiar faces in our lives, which we're really glad to see here, and also always welcoming new people to the space as well. The other question that I have for you is related to the stuff of this work, and I share this with full acknowledgement that that this particular kind of polling mechanism is not necessarily the best for capturing the nuances of these discussions. And so, you know, I invite you to respond in a way that is closest to your own experiences, with acknowledgement that you might have wished to reply in multiple ways, or that maybe this doesn't really quite capture it and you'd like to add something else about this in the chat. So this is an interesting snapshot of where people are sitting with regard to decolonization. And for many, it's something that is coming up often in their professional lives, and it's the space of ongoing exploration. So we're really glad to be able to welcome our panelists here. We're going to stop our slides now, and I'm going to welcome Chris Lewis and Jessie Williams to this room. Really excited to see you both here. We'll see more fulsome bios from Jessie and Chris in the chat. You can learn more about them. They wear many hats in their communities, and I feel really blessed to have them both in this room during this extremely busy time of year. You could be anywhere and you chose to be here, and we are really grateful for that. Jessie Williams is the Director of Indigenous Relations for SFU's Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and she's more than that. She's also part of CERi's advisory board, and just somebody who I think has such incisive perspectives and really important, doing really important work in these arenas. Chris Lewis, whose ancestral name is Syeta'xtn, is an elected member of the Squamish Nation Chiefs and Council, and he's been on the SFU Board of Governors for 6 years and is in the process of wrapping up that term as soon as tomorrow. So into our questions here for both of you, and we'll start with Jessie. I'm curious about what a decolonized approach to community engagement and research means to you.
Thank you so much for this invitation. I really do appreciate being invited to this space. Really, in the role in my life, as well as my professional career, I am really focused on contributing to the work of my elders, my ancestors, and colleagues who have been doing this work for many years. as part of decolonizing community engaged research in a way that supports remaking the table for knowledge production that informs our work and life. We need to rethink, reframe, and relearn in this work together in a way that supports collective well-being, equity, and growth as a society. There are 4 key, what many would call strategic steps that I refer to as seeds that need to be planted and watered regarding decolonizing efforts that I want to share with you today. First, I've been taught that before we do meaningful work such as decolonizing focused work, we must begin with into me see soul work. So what I'm going to do in this moment is ask you to join me in a self-reflective activity. Take a deep breath, connect with your mental, your emotional, your physical, and your spiritual intelligence. Reflect upon the teaching that guides you in your work, your gifts, your knowledge, and your purpose. Where do you feel this in your body? What emotions are arising? What thoughts come up? And what is your inner voice saying to you about this work? Ask yourself, what is it that inspired you to attend this virtual circle, this dialogue, and this sharing today? Lean on that, center it, and use this knowing and bring that into this conversation and into every space you show up to in decolonizing research work and spaces. This helps bring in authentic energy and accurate intentions with each other. Secondly, understand the needs and goals of First Nations communities. This means we must invest in building right relationships, in part focused on reciprocity. In my engagement with First Nations communities, in my position with the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at SFU, it has been shared many times that external partners need to be present in Indigenous communities. Partners are invited to reach out to these communities to plant the seeds of right relationship building by first listening to what the goals and objectives of the communities are before seeking to engage in research work or understand and bring in Indigenous perspectives. Indigenous community partners consistently identify capacity building as one of the most important goals given the large demand of requests from external partners. Consider in your area of work, research, how can you lift up Indigenous communities at the same time as supporting organizational, professional, and personal objectives? At times, partners don't always understand how many external partners reach out to communities asking for knowledge, inviting to share needs and share knowledge holder teachings, not realizing how much of a resource drain that is on the community, as it is often a choice between supporting a partner in their work versus providing programming and services to their own community members. While it is respectful to invite First Nations communities to the table, understand it can be a strain on human resources for the people they serve. How are we giving back? In building reciprocal relationships, this creates regular connection, develops new space for understanding and relating, and helps us evolve this work together. Thirdly, create safe and brave spaces where we can learn to pull together. How can we be more inclusive and widen the circle for the diverse voices needed in decolonizing research efforts? Spaces for this learning and sharing can sometimes feel exclusive, with the dominant voice or dominant narrative at times being internal, like-minded, like-experienced, and thus some biased perspectives. I invite each of you to write this moving forward. Take a look around you. Take note of whose voices are present in the room, on the board, on the committee. Who are your colleagues? Who are the decision makers and partners of the decolonizing work you are doing? Then reflect and consider whose voices need to be present and have they been invited? It is one thing to know it's essential to decolonize the work we do, including research. It's another to move past intention and to center it in our planning, engagement, research, design, and structure from the beginning stages. Fourthly, It is important to embrace discomfort. Organizational structure and competition for limited resources that supports decolonizing research work is often a significant challenge, which causes tension and resistance to colonizing efforts and partnerships. Resistance can often be a sign of an unmet need in other areas. Pay attention to this. We need to review and reinvigorate administrative policies, procedures, and amend that which are being experienced as structural boundaries and glass ceilings in decolonizing research and work. In order to do that, we need to be in alignment with our leadership and have their support. This is an important conversation, an important step that needs to be nurtured and needs to happen. When there are humans like you and our colleagues like us who are in support of such goals, who may not have leadership support, that leads to undiscovered evolution of decolonizing efforts. At times, it can feel difficult and uncomfortable addressing these challenges, but we must learn to embrace this and other discomfort together in order for transformation to happen. In closing, I know I only have a few minutes to kind of plant the seeds of where I come and what I bring into my space of work. I want to share a wisdom nugget with you that my relative Ron Johnson once shared with me. He said, finding meaningful connections is like poking at a fire. Pay attention to the sparks. What this means to me is that we need to seek out people who are of like passion and purpose in our decolonizing work together. Thank you.
Beautiful, Jessie. Thank you so much for sharing this. Chris, I'd love to invite you into this space and share a reflection about what a decolonized approach to community engagement and research means to you.
Thank you, Jackie, and honored just to have the invitation today and sit on the panel with my relative Jessie, and we work very closely together in the community, and we don't get to sit on the panel like this ever before, so it's quite unique and heartwarming. So I want to open up in my language. Hatsqual Tanoyap, Siams, Chinquamentomi, Kakakanak. Syeta'xtn, Queens Na, Skahop Mishokamel, not Flakma'al, stuff. Just saying in my language of the Skahopmish people, it's great to see each and every one of you today, even though I can't see you. Thank you for taking the time out to hear our words today. Really appreciate it, and I'm honored by your presence. I want to thank the Creator again for the beautiful day and the resilience of spring as we see in Vancouver. I come to you from the Skahopmish people, the Squamish Nation. I live along a creek called Tlakma'alk, which is known as McKay Creek in North Vancouver, which means the salty kind of place. The creek is a little salty at the mouth. So just reconciling myself with where I'm at this time and letting all of you know that. To move forward, I really just want to thank you for the question, Jackie, around decolonizing the approaches to community engagement and to research and what that means to me. When I think of decolonization and reconciliation kind of in tandem, the pathway is not an easy one. Very on in kind of my professional career and all of the work that I've done around decolonization, it became very apparent that reconciliation and decolonization appears in an emotional realm, because what we're trying to do is reconstruct a new reality and deconstruct the current reality that may or may not be a flawed relationship between Indigenous peoples and an institution or the Canadian government or society as a whole. So I really want to acknowledge the use of terminology, because I feel a lot of people, when we start talking about decolonization and indigenization and reconciliation, we get stuck on terminology. And I think it's really my advice to all of you is to be open to all of that. when we think of decolonization, I can think of my best friends that I would talk to over a weekend at a barbecue, and they're thinking decolonization means this, like sovereignty, disconnection from the state, recognition from the state. We're printing our own money, or we have our own institutions, all the way to something where we're integrating into kind of Canadian society, and it's a little bit of a hybrid process. And there's everything in between. So there's many perspectives, and my advice to all of you is that there's no right one. It's just the journey that you're going to embark upon. And when we think about decolonizing approaches to community research, I think about how would I do it if it was just me, and looking at how would I walk into a community or engage a community on an initiative that I would want to do. We really need to meet the community at their level, and we need to recognize that entering into that emotional realm is healthy. Is that your questions, the process of decolonization or reconciliation or indigenization, and I'll use all three interchangeably, it's going to invoke emotion from the Indigenous community. Residential schools is going to come up. A past hurt from your institution is going to come up. A way the government has treated. We've all inherited this relationship, this all flawed relationship, but I think we all have a responsibility to fix it and pass on a better relationship to the next generation. So I think about how we respectfully acknowledge the tensions around terminology, and that no single term is acceptable. It's a process of figuring out what type of term you're going to use and which one is preferred by others. In my view, decolonization represents the social political agenda that seeks to redress the historical and current practices that have had very adverse effects on Indigenous communities. It's dismantling. It's blowing up the system. It's being very disruptive. Where when you think of indigenization and reconciliation, it's really about incorporating ways of knowing, Indigenous knowledge and practices into the institution. It's more of a blending. So there's wiggle room in there, but I find that regardless of what terminology you use, you're going to enter that emotional train. And I encourage all of you, it looks like a mountain. I've referred to it as a wave. I've explained it to my daughter, like the movie, Disney people that are in here, the movie Moana, where she has to get over the break and to get into the open ocean. It's the hardest thing to do. It's just to get over that first big break wave. And decolonization, indigenization, and reconciliation is no different. You're gonna go over a big wave that's going to be daunting and scary, and it's going to bang you up, and you're going to feel uncomfortable and unsettled. But if you get over that wave, you're going to get into some good smooth water. It might still be choppy. You don't know what's coming, but you've done it together with the Indigenous community. You've listened. You've heard their emotion, their tears, where they want to come from. And that's when you get into a place where trust is built. And one of my mentors always said that change happens at the speed of trust, and trust happens at the speed of relationships. So it's really about building a trustful and a safe environment for Indigenous communities to move forward. A prime example I'd want to use is during the Aboriginal Reconciliation Council work that I did with SFU. I was a co-chair in that process. We met with an Indigenous community, and I'll leave them nameless because I don't have permission to kind of name them outright. We met with them and we said, we're embarking upon this decolonization reconciliation process with Simon Fraser University, and we're going to respond to the calls of action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and all of this sounds super good. And the community didn't say anything. It was very muted. It was very yes, no. There wasn't any intentional deep dive kind of conversation into it. And my co-chair at the time looked at me and said, what do we do? Like, what's happening? And we were about 2 hours into the meeting. And I basically said, what did the university do? And they just unleashed this emotional realm where in the past, and it was decades before our time meeting with them, a researcher went into the community and did some horrible things from their point of view. And it didn't matter what the university thought, if it was ethical or not. The community didn't think it was ethical. And so we were inheriting all of that emotional pain that we needed to get through. And we got through it, but it was tough. So I think my first aspect is we need to, around decolonization of approaches, be prepared to get uncomfortable, because once you're uncomfortable, you really get into the good spot. I'll stop there. I can talk all day, Jackie, about this. So thank you.
I love this. Thank you so much, Chris. And thank you so much, Jessie, for sharing this. I agree with you that this is it's a personal journey, and we need to do the inner work that facilitates this work in community in a big, big way. Before we go to audience questions, and I'd like to invite those of you who'd like to, you could include a question in the Q&A for us if you'd wish, or on Padlet if it's working for you. I'd like to invite Chris and Jessie to ask a brief question of each other first before we get into it.
Would you like to go first, Chris, or would you like me to?
Yeah, I wrote one down, Jessie. So you really talked about who should be involved. My question to you is, as you've advised people to look around their circles, are there certain people in a circle that need to be involved in a process of decolonization around community engagement and research? Like, who are the necessary players around that circle that you think need to be involved? And it's it's a non-starter if they're not involved.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I can't wait till you hear my questions, because it's very linked to yours. In my role, one of the key voices that I recognize that isn't currently present when it comes to educational research and engagement on decolonization is Indigenous student voice. Everywhere I go and everywhere I've been in the past, probably 6 months, I can't count how many meetings that I've been to where Indigenous students are asking to be invited into the rooms of conversations regarding reconciliation and decolonization across the board. And I think we forget that sometimes, but the beauty is in community. And my relative Chris knows this, that everything we do, we involve our young people. That everywhere, all the meaningful work and the meaningful conversations that happen, there's an auntie or an uncle or a older cousin, or a grandparent or a parent or a leader is mentoring somebody. I think that that's something we forget to do, given the whole reason in an educational context that we are here, that we have jobs, that we're doing the work we do is to service our students. And one of the real important intentions for reconciliation and decolonization work is to ensure that there's space and presence of Indigenous voices and peoples and perspectives, so that Indigenous students feel welcomed, feel like they belong, can relate to what is being shared and taught and understand, and know how to bring that into their life and into their world to make a meaningful difference, but also to be able to create space and the resources and the knowledge for others, because I think there's so much beauty in our teachings, in our way of knowing and being and educating and living as Indigenous people that is beautiful and could be good medicine for anyone else who is open to understanding and knowing what that looks like. So I think the voice that needs to be there that currently is not are students.
Thank you. And Jessie, your connected question for Chris.
Yes, I love this. Like, we're in sync. So my question, Chris, is, given your diverse voices and connection to SFU, in that you're a graduate of SFU, you got your bachelor's degree, also as an external Indigenous community partner, being an elected leader for the Squamish Nation, but also the many years you've have experience in being a leader at SFU on the Board of Governors. What do you think is missing from the engagement, given those three perspectives and voices that you bring to SFU?
Excellent question, Jesse. And I think it dovetails really nicely in terms of what we've been talking about. It really comes down to, with all my experience at the local First Nations community level, on the Board of Governors, participating in community engagement around reconciliation, decolonization at SFU, is really what is missing is the infrastructure. I mean, the governance infrastructure, the human infrastructure, and sometimes the financial infrastructure to kind of actually do the work. I find that the challenge is that I would say it's pretty easy to get a report to kind of say what to do. It's another thing to actually start building the infrastructure to implement, because what happens is you're then fundamentally creating different cogs in an institutionalized wheel and seeing if it fits in. Or you're breaking down the institutional engine to kind of say, we're going to do something different. And it really starts unsettling the work, where there's faculty and staff and units that say reconciliation isn't a part of what I do over here in my faculty. So why do I need to kind of deal with this? And it's really about that educational approach. But when we think about it, we all have a responsibility to kind of build those infrastructures, because I find that what happens is when you embark upon this work, you find the siloed work that tends to be really good. Like the Faculty of Education or social sciences doing something phenomenal, innovative, but nobody knows about it. And then all of a sudden everybody knows about it. And then you come out and you say, we need to kind of model this and macroize it to the institution and kind of figure out and start building all of these institutions. As much as energy went into the research and the engagement around finding the critical pathway forward, you almost need double the energy to kind of start building the infrastructure. Because Jesse, you're absolutely correct. What tends to happen is all of the work just continues to get put on the same 10 or 20 people, mostly Indigenous, that are doing it on the side of the desk. And I think what the institution needs to do, and this isn't just SFU, I would say any, is really bring in the capacity so that somebody's just living and breathing kind of reconciliation, indigenization, and then you're building critical infrastructure into the institution that works with, if it's a bicameral system, that when you're talking about indigenizing curriculum, that there's a subcommittee at Senate level that's assisting Senate in terms of how that works, that there's these epicenters of Indigenous knowledge, epicenters of Indigenous dialogue that showcases and is open to the entire university community so that people can go and get the knowledge from a central place, but also that central place is in charge of ensuring that we no longer get siloed again. And I think that infrastructure is very well needed. You need senior leadership. You need an infrastructure to kind of continue to run with it. And it takes resources. It takes staff. It takes courage. And then that's just in the institution. You also need runners, I would say, that know protocol and how to walk into a First Nations community, into a First Nations administration building or an elder center, and uphold the protocols to say, hey, we're doing these great things at SFU or whatever institution you're at, and we want you to come, or we're going to come to you. And we're going to do it in a respectful way. It's like, you need to have people with the protocols and the understanding to do that, because one misstep, the elders will kick you out of the room. And all intentions could be good, but you might fall down because you didn't follow the appropriate community cultural steps. And each community is a little different. And that's what leads to the challenge, is that you kind of need somebody to kind of help you guide. And I'll put it in a traditional context to really decolonization. This approach is, if I was in a ceremony and I wanted to do something and invite the community to my ceremony, but I was in a different ceremony, I wouldn't get up and say it myself. I would hire somebody that knew the rules and the protocol and had the respect of the floor. to get up and say Syeta'xtn and his family are going to have a naming and a ceremony 1 year from now, and you all are invited. The institution has to do the same thing, is that we need to understand all of those in it. We need to understand that so that we start off in a good way. So hopefully I answered your question. And it really needs courage and leadership. You talked a little bit about leadership support. It needs to come from the top. The presidents, the provost, the vice presidents all need to be kind of understanding that indigenization, reconciliation, and decolonization is something of a priority for the institution. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, these are very, I think, really helpful, but you were providing really concrete examples of how to move forward and how to step into that work of dismantling, unsettling these structures that continue to harm. And a question that comes from, perhaps connected to what Jessie was sharing earlier about the emotional labor that's involved in this work of community engagement, of where I think this falls sometimes around widespread diversity and inclusion efforts. A question that someone asks is about how can or should institutions create systems or structures to ensure that we're not overwhelming Indigenous communities with multitudes of asks stemming from the many different people, faculty, programs, et cetera. I think that some of what Chris was sharing is in direct response to that. And I'm curious, hearing from Jessie about how to work in that way, work with the consciousness that this is asking a lot of people.
It's a really meaningful question. And I think it's something that as an external partner, we always need to be conscious of, and we need to be fluid too, because the needs of communities and the resources and capacity changes and evolves through time. I think we need to begin to become more inventive and more innovative in how we build capacity in the communities to be able to respond. For example, the institution, and in a lot of the conversations that I'm involved in, is that there's a lack of Indigenous faculty members, Indigenous instructors, just one example. And my response to that is, how do we as an institution, as a partner, help build up and create programming and supports to help increase the pot, so to speak, of Indigenous faculty members and instructors. So how do we build the capacity? So I keep going back to capacity when I think about this, is we need to be more inventive on how we help ensure that there are enough qualified and interested Indigenous folks, or else those allies who have experience working with Indigenous communities in the areas that we're coming into this conversation on decolonization about, in this context, education. Another example is, in my previous role working with the Squamish Nation as the manager of education, I worked really closely with a separate post-secondary institution, and they were asking us questions about what our educational goals and objectives are. They wanted to understand what our post-secondary needs are as a community. And what I said is, we would love to answer that. We have a good idea, but we need some support in order, if you really want the current, right now, lived reality and needs of what educational goals are and needs of our people, you need to help us find that information out. So what they did is we got them to hire and support post-secondary Squamish Nation members who went out into the community and did surveys. They had identified a faculty member to help kind of be the leader of this project initiative alongside our community. And we got 400 surveys in 1 week from post-secondary students currently that attended that post-secondary institution to go out and find that answer, to bring back the information. And what the institution did is they helped help our staff understand and learn a new program that they used, and statistical kind of review. It was an amazing capacity building moment, and that is just a prime example of how we need to think about creating capacity so that there are systems in place, reciprocal relationships in place that help us have more voices to invite into the conversation. Right now, we're still in the building phase. We're still in the building phase right now as Indigenous peoples. And we are asking and open to understanding how we can build that resource pool together. So that is my first initial kind of thoughts on that question.
Thank you. And, we have 159 people in the room right now, people from a number of backgrounds and experiences, a number of spaces that they're sitting with this work in their working lives. And this is a question from someone who is curious about how to move this work forward in the way that they can. And they're asking, do you have any advice for non-Indigenous people who don't have very much power in their institutions or organizations? So say they're not in management, they're not really in a leadership position, who are trying to engage in decolonization of said institution.
I'll take that one on, Jack. I think the process of decolonization and reconciliation, I would say, is multifaceted as we're thinking of an institutionalized process right now. But when I think about the process of decolonization and reconciliation, I think about the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action. And when I heard the 94 calls to action from Justice Sinclair as an Indigenous leader, he was at the Assembly First Nations, and we spent the afternoon going over them. He said, this is a collective approach. We all have a duty to do it, but it's also an individual personal mission as well. And to the question is that there's also processes of reconciliation and decolonization that the individual can do. And so my recommendation, and I say this to everybody at every scale that I can, is if you want to embark upon this journey, read the 94 calls to action and pick one. Pick one that just sings to your heart and that hits you in the gut, and be a champion in your own way. If you're just, if you're at whatever scale within the institution or a job that you're at, just pick that one and say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to learn about Indigenous history and kind of why the relationship is the way it is. And I'm going to continue to educate others about it. And Murray Sinclair kind of said to me personally, he said, and to all the Indigenous leaders in the room, he said, I want you to do the same thing. As Indigenous leaders, I want you to pick one and be a champion. And if you get done in your lifetime, pick another one and do the same thing. And so on and so on and so on. So I offer that challenge out to everybody, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. It's not just my job. It's not just Jessie's job or the institution's job. It's every individual in this great world of ours to kind of embark upon that journey. So thank you.
Thank you. This is my last question that consists of kind of two related questions coming up from Padlet, and then we'll go to your closing reflections. This is a question that I think relates back to what Chris was saying. You're painting a picture of your family barbecue. People have different ideas of what decolonization means. And so do we decolonize Western academia, or do we create a new space for Indigenous academia? And also, how do we disrupt the really violent ways that that even community-based research is informed by whiteness through and through? I think that those are connected questions in terms of, how do we dismantle the whiteness of the institutions and the structures that we're working in? And two, what is there one way? Is there, I think that what you're alluding to is the multitude of approaches that exist. But thinking about decolonizing Western academia or creating new space for Indigenous academia, I'm curious about your thoughts on those.
Yeah, I can see Jessie writing away, so I'll quickly kind of answer that. I don't think there is a right way. It's the process of how you embark upon it. And so in one area of the world, it might be completely dismantling kind of the Eurocentric kind of institutionalized kind of structure of how things go. And there might be leadership and ability to do that, and all to you, like, go if there's the will to do it. In another realm, there might be ability to kind of do a hybrid process of, like, building up indigenous institutions to then adapt and transform the non-indigenous institutions, and you might come out the back end with something completely different. You just don't know what you're going to get. But I think what's vitally missing here is, and Jessie talked about capacity, is the indigenous institutions, if they're within or outside of the institution, need to be built up. They need to be built up to be empowered and have the capacity to really start answering some of those tough questions, to really embark upon the process of decolonization in their own way. And the institution can help them in that. What are some of the questions that you want to ask? What does the future hold? Like really kind of getting into those types of questions. So I really drive away from a pan-indigenous, pan-aboriginal kind of approach. There's not going to be a cookie cutter approach to this process. It has to be very localized, and it has to be very centralized in terms of the relationship that the institution, wherever it is in the world, is inheriting. Because the relationship here at SFU between SFU and Squamish might be different than, an institution on the East Coast and our Mi'kmaq relatives. And the two systems, what works in SFU might not work over there. But if the principles are the same, we might get to a good spot. So thank you.
Thank you.
It's a really deep question, and I really appreciate it. I mean, the first thing I think about when I think about how do we dismantle the whiteness of institutions as we work together in reconciliation and decolonization, whether it be in engagement or research, programs, services, policies, systems, and all aspects of working and being and living in our community, is truth. To me, I think until we can comfortably acknowledge, reflect, and talk about the truth of the history and the today presence of Indigenous people, it's hard to move forward and understand how we bring all of that together. Because if we don't talk about the truth, then we miss out on relating to each other. We miss out on understanding each other. And I think those are really core pieces to bring into how we express and connect on our different perspectives and our different experiences of being a part of the society. The whole reason we're here is for communal societal gains. And until we talk about the truth of the history of Indigenous people and the current, and acknowledge and create space for talking about the current presence and the future of Indigenous people and how that connects and the importance of that in the world that we live, I think we can't move forward. We can't talk about dismantling whiteness in the way that I think most of us are trying to do. And also, we miss out, if we don't talk about the truth, then we miss out on understanding each other's upbringing. If we don't understand our upbringing, then we can't relate to each other. And I think that's really important. And then part of the question regarding how do we separate the perspectives? Do we bring them together? I totally agree with my relative, Chris, that we need to create space for both. We need to be fluid. We need to recognize and understand that the relationships each community has with the particular partner that you might be representing is different, which means there's going to be a different type of need to start that work together. Sometimes communities want their own space, and sometimes they want to be a part of the broader community. And I think our responsibility is to be honest, again, be truthful about the ways that we don't allow that work to happen because of process, procedure, organizational structure, or just lack of understanding of what it truly means to understand and bring in Indigenous perspectives to help our society thrive. And I think that's my perspective.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I'm deeply appreciating both of your contributions in terms of how to move beyond what I think can be problematic binary thinking sometimes, or either or thinking that can inform or sometimes block good work and emotional work from happening too, because of course this is not the stuff of one particular formula. I wonder, as we close this session, there's so much more to discuss, of course, lots of really interesting questions that people were just raising just now. And I think that this is certainly a space of learning that I hope that people will continue doing in their lives wherever they can. I wonder if maybe we could start with Chris and move on to Jessie. If there's any way to bring this to kind of a close as we end this time together, maybe you could share a 2 or 3 sentence reflection on where the energy for this work is for you right now, and what you'd like to leave people with today.
Thank you, Jackie. And one of the first things we learned when we did the Aboriginal Reconciliation Council work at SFU is the Indigenous community internally and externally kind of basically had this mantra with there's nothing about us without us. So the university can't do anything about us without us, either internally, and it talks to Jessie's empowerment of the students. It came loud and clear. The other aspect is we all know what needs to happen. Like, it's the infrastructure, the capacity, the governance structure, and the structures within the institution and within the Indigenous communities that we need to build. So and I know that was one of the questions I looked, is that through the ARC process, we asked for the institution to develop an Indigenous Cultural Resource Center that would be an epicenter for cultural resources for the entire university, regardless of your faculty and where you come from, if you're a senior level staff, lower level staff. On the research side, there was also at the university, it was call number 34, which was the last one, to convene an Indigenous research committee to really create and mobilize research knowledge, including Indigenous research, and partner with Indigenous communities at all levels in an ethically based and respectful process, and really foster an environment between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students at all levels around Indigenous methodologies and protocols around conducting research, and that there would be a center on how you would do research within Indigenous communities, and that you're pulling that expertise into the institution and kind of creating a little bit of a one-stop shop that everybody can go to kind of ensure, regardless if they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, to kind of continue that work. And lastly, we called upon, and I mentioned this earlier, the structures within the institution to indigenize curriculum, and what did that look like, and creating structures within Senate. All of that stuff was very controversial. Like, it was very like, what are you doing? But what happens if you don't do that is that the work gets siloed. You call the Indigenous person that you know and say, hey, can you help me on this? And the information doesn't get centralized, so that, we're not recreating the wheel every time that we're doing community engagement and decolonization work, that we're trying to build upon something. But there needs to be some central agency to kind of know what's going on. So thank you.
Thank you. And Jessie.
So much. I think what's really important to recognize and to remember as we continue to do this work together and on our own is that there are different people and there's different voices in this conversation. There's the people who aren't interested, who aren't ready, and don't believe in the need to bring in Indigenous perspectives into engagement and into research or whatever area we're working in. There are those people who are ready, who are interested, but don't know where to start. And then there are those people who have begun their work, they're doing it, but they need some more guidance in order to become the champions and to become the voices in the room when the same individuals that are doing most of this work aren't there anymore. So they become the champions of reconciliation and decolonization. And then I think we have to make sure we hold that close to our center when we're having conversations and when we're creating space, because this is the community we serve. This is the reality of our society. And if we don't remember that and create space for all those voices to be heard, then the work isn't being done in a good way. We talk about setting the table and remaking the table. That means we need to do work in a good way, and all voices need to be welcomed into that conversation, because that is the reality of our society that we live in, each and every one of us. And also what I think of is that we need a ancestral. It means uphold one another in my language. And when I think of that is I think of And it leans on and builds on the quote that I shared earlier about poking at a fire and paying attention to the sparks, that we need to do this work collaboratively and together. And that means we need to get creative again and innovative again in how we create space and where and when we create space to be able to support each other in this work, because none of us can do this alone. The work is too big and too important. And when we uphold one another in this work, amazing things happen. I think that what we need to do is to be a bit more brave, and we need to create what that space looks like. Do not wait to be invited to a committee or a board or a formal conversation to start supporting each other in this work. Start creating those spaces for yourself, because time's too precious. We need your voice. We need you to be creating new spaces and helping imagine and reimagine what those spaces look like. So please don't wait to be invited. Seek out those lights, seek out others to do this work and to evolve and grow together. Don't wait to be invited. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much. I'm witnessing the courage and the boldness and the heart that you both bring to this work. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for you both joining us here today. What you've shared is so brilliant and extreme, just so actionable, that we are deeply so appreciative of this. Thank you, Chris and Jessie, for your time. This is an ongoing and forever conversation, and I'm so glad that we're able to share a part of it here with you together. Just on behalf of everybody at CERi, I just want to thank everybody for joining us here today. This has been a really rich conversation. You'll see, if you want to add anything for us later on, the Padlet will still be up, and we invite you to participate in our event survey if you'd like to give us any feedback about how things went for you today. But in the meantime, I hope you have a beautiful day. It's beautiful and sunny in Vancouver, the last one that we'll have for a while. So I hope that people get to go outside and enjoy it. And I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you. Thank you, Chris and Jessie.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My honor.